All right, what do you know about Song of Solomon? Solomon wrote it. What else do you know?
One of those books about love between a man and woman that doesn't get taught very often.
It's about love between a man and a woman that doesn't get taught very often. Bernard of Clairvaux was I guess we would consider him a Catholic, but he was very early in church history. I did look this up, seemingly like 300s AD. But he had like 300 sermons on the Song of Solomon. But because of the nature of the book, the Jews typically turned it into a metaphor for the love that God has for Israel. And then early Christians, like Bernard of Clairvaux, adapted it into a metaphor for the love that Jesus has for His church. Well, that's all fine and good, except that's not the point of the book. The book's not about God's love for Israel, and it's not about Jesus' love for His church. It's about a man's love for a woman. Woman love for a man. That's what it's about. It's about husband and wife relationship. There's one other point that you can draw from this book too without knowing anything about it, just by looking at the screen. What else do you know about the Song of Solomon? It's a song. It's actually poetry. But that's what songs are, right? Poetry. Poetry set to music. God has given us a book in His inspired library of communication that points us to His idea of romantic love and what it takes to maintain a marriage that is more conducive to one romantic high after another. It's the book, The Song of Solomon. I put up the first sets of lyrics from this Celine Dion song, If the Walls Could Talk. If your walls could talk, what would they say? This is a love song. In this poem that Solomon has written, the Song of Solomon, what God gives us is a picture into this relationship between this bride and groom. He pulls back the curtain, He allows the walls to talk, and we see and hear what goes on between this man and woman. The sexual drive, or the sexual relationship, obviously is a very strong, important aspect of our human nature. So strong is it that it has become intertwined in our books, in our movies, television shows, video games, songs, poetry, advertisements. It was not uncommon early on when we were in Romania for companies, including Coca-Cola, to use nude women on their billboards. That's pretty standard in Europe. Or at least it was at a period of time. Maybe they've gotten some standards by now. But it's all around us. It's everywhere. The one thing that we as humans do that is the most private of all of our behavior has become one of the most public behaviors of all. This is a gift from God, but man, just like he does everything else, man has perverted it. And a lot of Christians, a lot of people who claim to be Christians, and I'm thinking of Puritans, have overreacted to the perversions and have practically acted like this aspect of our human nature is wicked and evil. And the Song of Solomon teaches us that that just is not the case. Now, the Bible, of course, has much to say about our intimate relationships. These numbers come out of the the English Standard Version. The word adultery, 35 times. Adulterer, 10 times. Adulteress, 11 times. Immorality, 32 times. Prostitute, 38 times. Prostitution only once. Naked, 81 times. So it's clear that the Bible has a lot to say about this aspect of our nature, human relationships. That is an average of 3 times per every book of the Bible. So on average, every book of the Bible mentions one of these words 3 times. So the Bible has a lot to say. Now, all of these words are negative. So the Bible would be incomplete if it only spoke of sexuality in terms of prohibition and did not give a positive instruction to enable us to discover the joy of healthy love. Certainly, the physical aspect of our relationship between a man and a woman is not the whole of life, and it's not even the highest good. The highest good, of course, is helping each other serve Christ. That's the ultimate ideal of the marriage relationship. So while the Bible has a lot to say about intimacy from the negative side, don't do this. There's one book in the Bible completely devoted to the idea, do this. A book about married love. Because there's no human relationship that is more intense and interesting or intimate than that of a man and a woman who choose to get married. But of course, the Song of Solomon is not just a book about love and courtship. It is poetry. It's an elaboration, several, you probably agree, it's an elaboration on Genesis 2 and verse 25. In fact, turn to Genesis chapter 5 and verse 2 for just a moment. Genesis 2 and verse 25, the man and his wife were naked, and they were not ashamed. That's God's intention of the sexual relationship. And of course, in the Garden of Eden, up to the point where they ate of the forbidden fruit, the man and his wife were naked, likely engaged in a sexual relationship. Children are not in the picture. Now, there are some religions that teach that the sexual relationship is pretty much just about having children. And that's just not true at all. It's not true at all. God designed humanity to be male and female. Look at what Moses writes here in Genesis chapter 5 and verses 1 and 2. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. He created them. Who are the them? Man. He made them male and female, and He blessed them, and He named them, look at this, man. God created man, and then He made man into male and female. The point being that God uses the word man here in a broad sense. The Greek word is anthropos, anthropology, the study of mankind. So God says, I am making mankind, I'm making man in 2 genders. And the Song of Solomon elaborates on that. The reality is that this is not an area of human life which God has remained silent. Cody said we don't talk about it very much. I think partly because we have swung the other direction and overreacting to the perversion in our culture. In fact, to be honest with you, it just makes me feel uncomfortable to say the word sex out loud. That's why oftentimes I use the word gender. It doesn't sound so blunt, so 21st century. Parents, churches, we need to talk about God's plan for the sexual relationship as well as everything else that goes on in the marriage relationship. So the opening words, Song of Songs. How does your translation translate that? Song of Songs? Another translation?
So it's interesting, in mine, it has the title, Song of Songs, but the ones on the pages are Song of Songs.
Well, verse 1 says, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Now, the Song of Songs, that phrase is a Hebrew idiom that means the best of all songs. What was that inner room called inside the tabernacle? The holiest of holies. See? That's the Hebrew way of saying the most holy place. Hebrew doesn't have a word for the most, so they just said the holiest of holies. This is the Song of Songs. This is the best of all songs. Now, the historian tells us in 1 Kings chapter 4 that Solomon wrote 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. So Solomon was a poet at heart. Now, you might find it odd that a man who had so many wives would write such beautiful poetry that's called the Song of Solomon. Maybe that's why he did have so many wives. He was a romantic at heart. And that was the days before Pinterest. When Jacob was courting Jewel, he did so many sweet things and said so many sappy things. I said, he's got to get this off of Pinterest. Can any male be that thoughtful? Maybe Solomon was. So the best of songs. Now, Psalms 119 is poetry. It's an acrostic. Every 8 verses begins with the next letter, consecutive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. We kind of talked about that with Lamentations, because that's the way Lamentations is written. So when the psalmist wrote Psalms 119, he put thought into it, writing this poem, but it's about the Bible. That 176 verse poem is about the Bible. This poem that Solomon calls the best of all poems is about love. About married love. And the song is passionate. The song is about marriage. It's about intimacy. It's about romance. There are passages in the song that we would get embarrassed reading in the Sunday morning worship. It presents sexuality as a good thing, protected by marriage, and not as an evil thing made permissible by marriage. Sometimes when somebody gets married, a friend will write "lust made legal," on the outside of their car or whatever. Well, that portrays the sexual relationship as something evil that's made legal by marriage. And that's not right. God designed the sexual relationship to be enjoyed. And without getting any details, obviously, but the nerve sensations in the appropriate places makes the sexual relationship enjoyable. Completely unrelated to having children. It's a gift from God. And the Song of Solomon helps us understand that. Now, again, being poetry, the Song of Solomon is not necessarily real. It's not necessarily historical. So for us to say, well, Solomon had all of these wives, what did he know about? Well, it's not historical. It might be. You could write poetry about historical events. Judges chapter 5 is a poem written about Judges chapter 4. But that's not the point of the song. The point of the song is to get picture of love between these two individuals. And of course, if it's given to us by God, then He's wanting us to learn some lessons from it. So as we go through these first 2 chapters tonight, I'm going to be asking you, what do we learn about strengthening the marriage relationship from these verses? So keep that question in your mind as we go through it. Solomon is mentioned 7 times in the book. And so he is likely the groom. Now there's a picture of another individual in the poem that some scholars refer to as the country boy. It might be that Solomon is the author and not the same individual as the groom. I think he is the groom. I think basically we've got three entities involved. We've got the groom, we've got the bride, and we've got the chorus. And if you look in your Bible, your translation should have the speakers divided up. For example, verse 2 is the bride speaking. How do we know it's the bride speaking when it does not say the bride said? How do we know the bride is speaking in verse 2? Okay, he. It uses the masculine pronoun he. That's one way to know who's speaking. Another way to know who's speaking is that in the Hebrew language, there are different forms for the second person, you, for masculine and feminine. There's also masculine, feminine, third person. Now we would use the pronoun he said or she said, but in Hebrew the verb itself, said, is going to have different forms if it's male or female. So that also helps us distinguish who's the one speaking. So it's very important as we go through here. Now my Bible, my translation does not have it in the text itself that the bride is speaking or the groom is speaking or the chorus is speaking, but it's got a footnote that directs me over to the center column which says, okay, here the bride is speaking, here the groom is speaking. If you'll notice at verse 4, the last half of verse 4, notice we've got the first person plural pronoun, we. We will rejoice in you and be glad. Well, that's the chorus singing. It's almost like a play, and we've got a narrator standing over here to the side. Or particularly in Greek drama or Greek tragedies where they would have a chorus that would sing songs in between plays that kind of help fill in the gaps in the action on stage. So we've got the chorus also. So we've got the bride, we've got the groom, we've got the chorus. The bride is from Shunem, and she's called the Shulamite, which interestingly enough is the feminine form of the name Solomon. Solomon, Shulamite. They're both plays on the noun peace. Shalom is the Hebrew word for peace. Romania has a lot of male and female names, a lot of male and female forms. We've got some in English, Paul and Paula or Pauline. Romania has Peter and Petronella. Petronella is the feminine form of the name Peter. So we've got Solomon and we've got the Shulamite woman, the bride. And then we've got the chorus. Now, as we go through, and we'll try to handle 2 chapters a night. We'll see how that goes. But look at chapter 3. Beginning in verse 6. We have Solomon showing up in what appears to be his wedding day. What is this coming up from the wilderness? And this is the chorus singing. What is this coming up from the wilderness like columns of smoke, perfume with myrrh and frankincense with all scented powders of the merchant? Behold, it is the traveling couch of Solomon. 60 mighty men around it, of the mighty men of Israel. All of them are wielders of the sword, expert in war. Each man has his sword at his side, guarding against the terrors of the night. King Solomon has made for himself a sedan chair for the timber of Lebanon. He made its post of silver, its back of gold, and its seat of purple fabric, with its interior lovingly fitted out by the daughters of Jerusalem. Go forth, O daughters of Zion, and gaze on King Solomon with a crown with which his mother has crowned him on the day of his wedding, on the day of the gladness, his gladness of heart. So Solomon is idealized here. He's the knight in shining armor that has come in to sweep his bride off her feet, carry her off to his palace as his bride. Now, during the poem, as we study it, we'll see that there are some stresses. Marriage has stresses, right? What are some of the things that cause stresses in marriage? Snoring. Okay, behaviors of the other person. Let's broaden it. Behaviors of the other person, because we don't want to embarrass Rachel and talk about her snoring. So what else what else puts pressure on marriage? Money. Communication. Kids. Yep. Genders. Yep. Gender differences. What else? In-laws. So there's a lot of things that put pressure on a marriage, and we see some of that in the Song of Solomon. And we'll see one of those in just a moment when we get to it. And that makes the bride in particular get stressed out. And in fact, who tends to get stressed out the quickest out of these things? Tends to be the woman, right? So the bride gets stressed out. But notice that they come together. Look at chapter 4, verse 16. Awake, O north wind, and come, wind of the south. Make my garden breathe out fragrance. Let its spices be wafted abroad. May my beloved come into his garden and eat its choice fruits. I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I have gathered my myrrh along with my balsam. I have eaten my honeycomb and my honey. I have drunk my wine and my milk. Eat, friends, drink, and imbibe deeply, O lovers. That is the heart of the poem. And it's an indication of a honeymoon experience. There have been things in the poem that has kept them apart, and now they've come together. The 6 weeks or 4 weeks leading up to the marriage are some of the most stressful days of the whole relationship, right? With all the stress of the wedding planning and all of that is very stressful. We're going to pay Anna just to elope. Good grief. So they've gone through all of these stresses, and now they get to come together. Now, the bride does most of the talking. We're not going to elaborate on that. Out of 117 verses, she talks 55 of them. And maybe 74. Some of the verses are not clear. But over and over again, we see them expressing their pleasure with each other. Not just the physical act, but with their words. Highlight how many times he refers to her as his beautiful darling. In fact, darling is his favorite term for her. The first church I worked with after I graduated from Freed-Hardeman, I was the associate minister there, and the pulpit minister had 2 girls. At the time, they were third and first. I remember the youngest one being in first grade. I just don't remember how much older the oldest one was, third and first, fourth and first. But the girls referred to their dad as Hun, short for honey. And one time we asked her, why do you call your dad Hun? And she said, because that's what Mom calls him. Dad was Hun to everybody in that house. Terms of endearment. Darling is Solomon's term of endearment for his bride. And we'll see that over and over again. So the lesson for us is that he or she needs to speak often. Husband or wife, male or female, needs to speak often and openly of his or her joy in their spouse. I don't do that like I should. Rachel does it so much, it makes me roll my eyes. How many times are you going to tell me you love me before I get out the door? I'd miss it if she didn't do that. Right? In fact, the word love, or related word like beloved, is used 58 times in 8 chapters. Am I doing my math right? That's 7 times per chapter. 7 times 8 is 56. Love, 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 love. Spoken and shown in action. You can't have one without the other, right? You can't just show it, you got to verbalize it. You can't just verbalize it, you got to show it. So let's take a look at the poem itself. First of all, the bride speaks, verses 2 through 7. May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your oils have a pleasing fragrance. Now what is that? In modern terms, what is that? Smell good? It's his aftershave. It's his Old Spice. Yes, that's what it is. But we also have our own scent, don't we? Each one of us have our own scent. Your name is like purified oil, therefore the maidens love you. What does that tell us about Solomon? He was good looking. What, Donna? Handsome. Easy to look at. He was well thought of by others, wasn't he? He was well thought of by others. How important is it for us to have a spouse who's well thought of by others? We want somebody that other people think good of, right? Well, that means we've got to be that person, right? I'm reading that biography about George Washington. George Washington was not a womanizer, as we tend to use that phrase today. But this biographer, Ron Chernow, he's the one that wrote the biography on Alexander Hamilton that very popular play was written off of. But George Washington sure loved to be in the presence of beautiful women. He was an excellent dancer too. George Washington was an excellent dancer. And he loved to dance with women, but he was not a womanizer. Some flirtatiousness, but according to his biographer, not in a way that gave him a bad reputation. Verse 4, draw me after you and let us run together. The king has brought me into his chambers. That's a picture of a wedding night. It hasn't happened yet, but it's the anticipation of it, right? The last 6 months before Rachel and I got married, she made up a little sign with a countdown, and she put on it, days I have until I become a New Holland. Tractor, yeah. Then the chorus speaks up and says, we will rejoice in you and be glad, and we will extol your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you. So what does that tell us about the woman? She doesn't think so, but others do. She's thought highly of as well, right? Other people think well of her. Rightly do they love you. She goes on in verse 5, this is still the bride speaking. I am black, but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not stare at me because I am swarthy or black, For the sun has burned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me caretaker of the vineyards, but I have not taken care of my own vineyard. Let's stop right there for just a moment. So she deprecates herself. And we see that she does that a couple of times. She's not prideful. She's not arrogant. She doesn't think she hung the moon. She's self-deprecating. She feels self-conscious about the color of her skin. Not black as in African American, but black as in being outside all the time. So this is a culture where lighter skinned women were considered more attractive than darker skinned women. Or at least that's the picture here. But also she worked outside. Now what does that tell us about her? She's industrious. Now the Jews praised that, right? The Jews praised industriousness, the virtuous woman, Proverbs chapter 31. My mother's sons were angry with me. Now who's her mother's sons? Her brothers. So we talked about outside stressors in a marriage relationship. What's her outside stressor? Her siblings. Her siblings are a stressor in their marriage relationship. They made me caretaker of the vineyards, but I'm not taking care of my own vineyard. So she's got work to do that she's falling down on, she feels like at least. Then she says, verse 7, tell me, O you whom my soul loves. Look at that phrase. You whom my soul loves. What does that phrase right there suggest to you? What does it tell you? Good way to put it. She loved it with all she had. The soul, the deepest, innermost part of her. I love you with my deepest inner being. Where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? So she wants to go to his pasture where she might find him. Remember, there's a lot of stresses, and they don't get to come together like they want to. And we don't know all the stressors. We don't understand all of them. We just know that there's something there keeping them from getting together. So then the groom speaks. If you yourself do not know, most beautiful among women, if you've got different colored pens and different colored highlighters, there's a phrase to highlight, most beautiful among women. How important is it to make our spouse feel like they are the most important person in our lives? How important is that? That's an easy question to answer, right? Very, very important. What does it, let me word it in a way that makes you say more than one word. What does it communicate to your spouse when you treat them as if they're the most important person in your life? Valued. Jeff, you said something? You show them and tell them that they're the most important, yeah. Because it communicates a value. It communicates commitment. When we were in Romania, Jewel, when we were first there, Jewel was our only child at the time. She was very young. And then a friend of ours had moved to Moscow to be a missionary. And he had his first baby, and actually a girl, when he was over there. And he sent us a picture of her. And she's cute. And I sent a picture back. And he said, well, my girl is cuter than yours. I said, I hope I never meet a dad who doesn't think his child is the cutest. That's the way husbands ought to feel about their wives, and wives ought to feel about their husbands. When Rachel was pregnant with Anna, we were staying with Rachel's sister. And her sister several times in the few days we were staying with them talked in front of her husband about how handsome Brad Pitt is. What does it communicate to your spouse when you're talking about how handsome or how beautiful somebody else is? What does that communicate? You don't live up to my standards. You don't live up to my standards. Best thing for you to do is keep your mouth shut, if that's what you're going to say. Solomon says, you're the most beautiful among women. Go forth on the trail of the flock and pasture your young goats by the tents of the shepherds. Go do your work. You have work to do. Do it. To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. You look like a horse. Is that what he's trying to communicate?
Well, even if it is a term of endearment.
Yes.
Chariots of Pharaoh would be prestigious
Yes. Decked out, colorful, decorated, elaborate. Yeah, and the horse, what else? Strong. Yeah, so he's not saying you look like a horse. He's saying you look decorated, you look beautiful, you look decked out. You know, whatever way you want to read that.
Well, again, even if he's calling her, yeah, there are some very pretty horses. So even if he's calling her a horse, it's not like we would say somebody was like a horse. You know, you look like the winner that can make the derby. I mean,
Yeah. I love it when Samson said, you wouldn't have figured out my riddle if you hadn't plowed with my heifer. Okay, I wouldn't recommend that. Verse 10, your cheeks are lovely with ornaments and your neck with strings of beads. So I think that's the reference to the mares. That's how they're decked out. That's how they're decorated, with ornaments hanging off of them, strings of beads and so forth. And then verse 11, the chorus comes back and says, we will make for you ornaments of gold with beads of silver. So if you're praising your bride for her looks, we'll make even more for her. We'll make her even prettier. Then the bride comes back in verse 12. While the king was at his table, now notice we know this is the bride talking because now she's talking about the king, third person. While the king was at his table, my perfume gave forth its fragrance. So tell me about her. She smells good too. She's got fragrance. She's got perfume. And she's got her own natural scent. Doesn't this suggest to us that we need to make ourselves attractive to our spouses? In whatever way that means. In whatever way that means. That's different for you as from me. In fact, the only person we really ought to be concerned about being attractive to is our spouse. Who cares what everybody else thinks? But does my spouse find me attractive? Verse 13, my beloved is to me a pouch of myrrh, which lies all night between my breasts. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms. Henna was known for its aroma, and it was used for fingernail polish and nail polish, toe-nail polish and fingernail polish. Not finger-toe polish, fingernail toe polish. You understand what I'm saying. That's what henna was used for. In the vineyards of En-Gedi. So she pictures him lying close to her, being together. Again, they've not come together yet. They don't do that until chapter 5:1. But that's her anticipation. That's her desire. And she's telling him that. She's telling him that. For those of you that still have a spouse in the workforce, do you ever send your spouse a text message and say, I can't wait to see you when I get home? Or you give them a call and say, I can't wait to see you when I get home? Put something in the lunchbox. Did he have a Dukes of Hazzard lunchbox like I did? Just a plain old black one, huh? Little notes. When Rachel's left the house, sometimes she'll leave little notes for me laying around different places. So she wants him to be close. Verse 15, Solomon is speaking now. How beautiful you are, my darling. I told you to highlight that. And darling is his term of endearment for her. How beautiful you are, my darling. How beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves. Don't answer this question out loud, but is there an attribute of your spouse that really turns you on? Do you let them know frequently? Solomon will talk about her eyes frequently. And that's not necessarily I'll stop there. He talks about her eyes. He likes her eyes. Compliments. We are so self-absorbed, and I really should be talking to the whole congregation on a Sunday morning when I say this, but we are so self-absorbed in our little world that we can't take time to compliment our spouse. And I'm talking to myself sometimes too. Come home and I've got my things that I'm ready to do, and Rachel's over there in the kitchen. Now, I did something this morning before I left to come to work that I don't normally do. You're going to think bad of me when I say this, but I just leaned over the table and kissed her. And because I don't normally do that, her eyes just got really big. Now, see, her eyes wouldn't get really big if I did it all the time. Verse 16. How handsome you are, my beloved, and so pleasant. Here's the bride speaking again. So pleasant. Indeed, our couch is luxuriant. The place where we get to sit together and talk and look into each other's eyes and get dreamy. The beams of our houses are cedars, our rafters cypresses. Solomon liked to use cedar, right? I like the smell of cedar. We got a cedar chest in our living room if you've never been in our house. Item of luxury. So we've only covered one chapter, and we'll cover 2 chapters next week. But they just can't get enough of expressing their admiration for each other. Does it almost sound sappy? Shouldn't there be an element of sappiness in our relationships? What does it communicate when we get sappy? What does it communicate? What does it communicate when a man gets sappy with his wife? Love. Tenderness. Women don't want tenderness in a man, do they? They want strength. You can be both, right? Do what? Tenderness is a type of strength. It is, isn't it? You've got to have a backbone to show your weakness. That sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? But you women do want tenderness in your man, don't you? Having 2 girls taught me tenderness. I know why God gave me girls. It was to teach me to be gentle. If I'd have had boys, you wouldn't have been around me. Anybody have any thoughts or comments on chapter 1?
I read on something that it was a book, not of falling in love, but building a love.
Yes, not falling in love, but building a love. Yeah, actually, I was expecting to get through chapter 2 tonight, but my last slide, this take-home message, successful marriage is not about focusing on receiving, it's about focusing on giving. That's what we'll come back to over and over again. It's not about what are you giving me, it's about what am I giving you. Any other thoughts or comments or questions? Rose of Sharon and Lily of the Valley. It's not talking about Jesus. It's talking about the wife. It's talking about the bride. That song we sing, Jesus, Rose of Sharon, and I found a friend in Jesus. He's the lily of the valley. Those two songs are written out of that mentality that says the Song of Solomon reflected the nature of the love Jesus has for his church. In and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's not what the song is about. And even if it was, the Rose of Sharon and the Lily of the Valley is chapter 2, verse 1, and that's the bride, which would be the church, not Jesus. You see how it's important to understand the context of the Bible verses before you go off and write songs about it? Poets. And I produced one. Okay, we'll quit. We'll be dismissed. We'll see you next week. Read chapters 2 and 3. Hopefully we'll cover 2 chapters next week.